and hello to those of you who are online. My name is Ranell. My pronouns are she, her. I am a white female in my early 40s with shoulder length brown hair. I am wearing a brown dress as well as a gold jacket. Before we get started, I do want to give a huge thank you to Abby and Jonathan for inviting me to take part in this conversation. I actually can't think of a better person than Abby to be taking over this conference and sending it in the direction that it needs to go. I honestly, if someone else had asked me to be here today, I probably wouldn't have. So thank you, Abby, and thank you, Jonathan. Many of you may know me from my work at IDA. I used to oversee various departments and initiatives at the organization in over that 7-year period that I was with IDA. I was actually pushed out of the organization in 2022 and was labeled hard to work with after I asked for accountability around the way the organization was treating some communities, as well as for its inability to engage in any true equity work that the organization so deeply needed, both internally and externally. My colleague, Tony Bell, who was also let go under really troubling circumstances, together we started a podcast called What's Up with Docs. We actually utilized that podcast to really try to navigate the situations that we were encountering at the organization at the time. I do want to say, during the worst part of the IndieWire deadline articles that went out over the spring, I think the most troubling aspect of all of that was that, and honestly did leave me with a lot of unresolved trauma, was the false narrative that was developed that the organization was healthy and had ethical practices before this management change. I just want to say that that's simply not true, and that there are several employees that would be willing to speak to that if they hadn't been forced to sign an NDA. I just want to say the truth is this is not an isolated experience. The majority of institutions in our community are white-led, and as a result are steeped in white supremacy work culture, which makes these environments not safe for anyone. I recognize the irony in coming back to this conference that I sacrificed my health, my values, my relationships, and my financial stability to lead this particular conversation really is not lost on me. Before we move on to introductions, I do want to frame this conversation a little bit. This is not a panel about solutions. And we, because many of us have done that emotional work already, and we're not here to do that. We are not here to talk or to care for power in this conversation. This is for folks who have experienced and are continuing to experience harm, and to sort of confirm what is happening to you is absolutely real. Hopefully also we can break down some of these structures as to why, just for our own understanding. We won't be going into details around everyone's experiences because honestly, we could spend hours on each person at the panel right now. But as Sarah-Tai actually put very beautifully in one of our prep calls, these are symptoms of something that applies to all of us. So kind of with that, I'm going to go ahead and start. So Lalita, if you want to go ahead and just talk a little bit about yourself and maybe how you're coming to this panel today.
Thank you, Ranell. Thank you for this very honest introduction, which I know is not easy. My name is Lalita Krishna. I'm a brown-skinned, have short hair. I'm wearing black and white jacket with black t-shirt. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a filmmaker from Canada. I'm based in Toronto. I am also I'm the co-chair. I wear too many hats in my volunteer capacity, and I think that's the context in which I'm going to be here on this panel today. So I'm the co-chair of the Ontario chapter of the Documentary Organization of Canada, which actually is turning 40 years next year, so very similar to the IDA. And the same organization started Hot Docs 10 years later, so I'm also the co-chair of Hot Docs, which is going to be 30 years next year. So in reflecting on this conversation and this panel, you know, I was just thinking about why institutions are the way they are. And that's kind of a common thread, I think, that I've experienced in the ones that I'm involved with, which is, I think when we look at how the IDA started, it probably started as an advocacy group, a group of people who believe passionately in documentaries and come together and want to do advocacy, want to talk about more funding, want to advocate for more opportunities for distribution, et cetera, et cetera. And I think they start an organization, and this is the history of many nonprofits. And I think I see this pattern everywhere. They get consumed in that, in the passion of what they're trying to achieve, and very soon realize that, or sometimes there's a trigger moment which creates these organizations, as we saw with the George Floyd situation, where a lot of organizations sprung up, pushing for equity. But very soon, the people who start getting busy with their own work, and they realize that, we've got to hire staff and we've got to and they get consumed with fundraising. When you look at fundraising, it's often a question of who do we bring on to do this fundraising? So then they create a board, and the board is usually comprised of people who are able to raise those funds, who have very different priorities. And then it becomes this whole power structure in terms of who's important, and the values often get a little bit subsumed. And the people who work, I think, are not valued for what they do anymore. And that's how the values of the organization start shifting. And I've seen this time and time again. And I think with legacy organizations like IDA, or I can't speak much about IDA, honestly, but only from hearing what you had to say, I see the patterns that at the documentary organization as well, we've had a similar pattern where people felt our objective is something out there and the issue is that Black and racialized and Indigenous people, we were fighting our own battles, which is fighting to get our foot in the door. If you think about it, what it was like 40 years ago, for those of us who were here 40 years ago, or even anywhere near here, even in the last 20 years, we're just fighting just to be able to get funding, to get the first opportunities to be introduced to these. So we were not part of those conversations with these organizations. And so equity and diversity was not an issue that, the people who ran these organizations even considered to be important. And all of a sudden, when you introduce that into the mix, they didn't know how to deal with it or how to go about it, because, we are documentary filmmakers. We have all the answers. We go around telling the world what's wrong with the rest of the world, and we have those answers. So it's very hard to try to change the minds of, we kind of the moral spine, if you will, of society. We uphold the values. So we're the hardest to change sometimes, people who are, because we believe that we have all the answers. And I've come across this time and time again, and it's just been a very difficult shift. And we can go more into those experiences a bit later.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for waiting. Rachel.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rachel Pronger. I am a white woman in my 30s. I have brown hair. I'm wearing a lilac blazer and a black and white jumpsuit. I am a writer and a curator, and I'm also co-founder of a feminist film collective called Invisible Women. I'm originally from the UK, but I'm currently based in Berlin. I moved countries at the same time as I went freelance, and you could almost say that I was running away from the toxic institutions that I had spent years working in the UK. I am one of many people who felt that they had to go freelance in order just to maintain a sense of integrity and pride in their work, because I felt that within cultural institutions in the UK, I'd worked in a number of cinemas and festivals, that I was constantly compromising on my own values and also often assisting in the reinforcing of structures that I felt were toxic through the work that I was doing, which is something I would really like to talk about later. But I think as someone, my background's in programming, as programmers, we often end up being used as positive PR to cover up practices within organizations. And it's something that we're complicit in, and we need to really question why we're doing that. I don't want to go too far into specifics, but just to give you a sense of where I'm coming from, my last full-time job in programming was at a 5-screen independent cinema in the north of England called Tyneside Cinema, which is very much the flagship of that part of the country for independent cultural cinema programming. And as a programmer there, I was constantly busy, constantly drowning in work, constantly putting in overtime to create programs that I felt were interesting and progressive and presenting interesting points of view and inviting in other people to join in with that programming practice. During the pandemic, the cinema was closed, and in that period of pause, a load of accusations emerged on social media from people who'd worked previously at the cinema, describing incidents of sexual harassment and bullying at the cinema that had been ignored by management and sometimes kind of assisted by management. The response of the CEO and the board was to release a very dismissive statement that completely undermined the accusations that had been made and did not take them seriously. As a result, various members of staff at the cinema, including myself, arranged a kind of staff uprising against this official statement that had come from the CEO and the board, basically saying, "You don't speak for us." And this resulted in quite a lot of media coverage in the UK, and eventually in the resignation of the CEO and members of the board, and an internal review of the cinema. In a way, that staff uprising, I suppose, suggested that there could be a way of seizing back control of institutional structures. But as I say, I then left and went freelance because I felt so burnt out by the experience. So I can't comment on how far the cinema itself has changed in a kind of a molecular level at this point. But yeah, just so you know where I'm coming from, that's my background, and I really hope to dig into these ideas a bit later.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you so much, both of you, all three of you actually, for what you shared. I'll do my visual description. I am a brown female wearing a white shirt and black shorts. I'm the creator of a project called This Work Isn't For Us, which was sort of started as a project about me trying to teach myself about the history of diversity policy in the UK. And it turned into a really personal study of how that diversity policy had kind of affected me, shaped my world, like the way that I saw everything in it, and also all of my relationships, so my professional and my personal relationships. I finished it in February 2020, and it was just like this Google Doc on my computer, and I tried to, for about a month and a half, tried to speak to people that I worked with, to tell them what I had learned and share it with them, because I really genuinely thought that if they had the right information, then they would change their behavior. And because I really, and no, but I really did believe that, like, it set me free as well. Like, I was like, oh wow, I understand how this works. And I had genuine faith that the people that I worked with, if they just knew the information, then they might have that same sort of feeling. And I guess what I kind of came across was many things. I think a lack of courage was just like a big part of it, and kind of a desire to keep things in place so that they could stay in belonging with the thing that they were attached to. And maybe we can talk a bit more about that attachment. And then the pandemic happened, and then the uprisings happened, and that's when I decided to, because I couldn't get anyone to read it even really, I decided to just release it online. And I did a series of I guess like I did a series of conversations, I did a performance, like I sort of made it into a piece of work that was like generative for me. And as a result of like it feeling really just, you know, similarly to your organizing, just feeling really quite burnt out by the process, even though like lots of good things came out of it. I decided to resign from my 2 institutional positions, which were at the British Council and the BFI, who also were really interesting reaction. Maybe we can talk about later to your situation. So this was all happening at a similar time that thing at Tyneside was happening, and I was really like faced with the fact that the BFI who employed me was like having lots of things to say about these issues suddenly, but like had received a sort of really rigorous like exploration of how they had perpetuated like the lack of diversity in our industry, but also the lack of care. So it was like really quite a dissonant time. I'm currently now like doing a PhD, and the thesis is entitled "What Do We Want from Each Other After We've Told Our Stories," which is like really, it's from a line from an Audre Lorde poem, and it's really what I'm thinking about now is, and it was very much influenced actually by the time in which that piece circulated. So I wouldn't say that it's
microphone, but I'm not sure about the Zoom.
Anti-Indigenous sentiment, ableism, all of these things that I just think that I could not handle. During that time, I came to know Jemma and her work, and she was a lovely support for me in a time that was quite lonely, and even just your work existing parallel to that experience is really reparative for me, so thank you. I was the only Black staff member there, so it was a lonely time, and kind of similar to the processes that Rachel was talking about. It was less the process of calling it out, that's easy. Anti-Blackness is everywhere, it's nothing particularly special or individual to me. But it was that process of so-called repair and accountability that really essentially broke me as a person. And I relate a lot to what you were saying specifically about This Work Is Not For Us, where it begins as this sort of testimony, this kind of a plea for help, and assuming folks will do the right thing, assuming folks will have a backbone and will do the right thing, even if it puts them at odds at the kind of very established defensive capital that all these institutions are at the end of the day. But that was simply not the case. And they're still doing their accountability thing. We had a so-called reparations process where I signed an NDA. I'm not sure if they know what reparations look like. It's involved signing an NDA. But yeah, essentially that experience is what has shaped so much of my politics and experience even more so. It was kind of a crash course in exactly what you're talking about, what might it look like to actually abolish these institutions and these industries. I don't look at it from a reparative or reformative paradigm. People are always laughing at me because I'm like, abolish nonprofits, but I'm telling the truth. It's like I'm just saying it in a fun, kind of punky way, but you know, something that has been on my, a lot of things have been on my mind recently within that, and it's kind of the kind of neoliberal co-opting of anti-racist politics and how that's being used to reform these institutions in a way that is actually discontinuing their white supremacist nature. And just like as a person, as a curator, as a writer, it's also spurred my interest in, you know, the unspoken. That's why we're here today. Unspoken histories, people who have been deemed, you know, trouble, a disruption, a thorn in the side. Who's not here is who I'm interested in, whose work has not been finished.
Yeah.
So that's me.
Yeah. Thank you. Cintia, let's see if we can get Cintia. If you want to introduce yourself. Yes. Oh no. Check to see if you're muted.
Sorry, it's my fault. Can you hear me?
We can definitely hear you, Cintia.
Sorry. Hi, everyone. I'm Cintia. I am a Portuguese woman. I'm in Lisbon now, in my study room. It's the evening, it's 10:15 in the evening. And I don't know, I'm a white Portuguese and I'm wearing a kind of reddish shirt. And thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Abby and Jonathan and Ranell, for making this. And yeah, I'm sorry I couldn't hear a big part of Jemma and what was said, but I will try to relate more or less because I was in the prep meeting. So just to introduce myself, so I'm 43 years old and I started working in film in Lisbon in Portugal when I was 21. And when I was 22, I gave up on working in film totally because the culture of harassment was just normal. Harassment, violence, psychological bullying, etc. So I totally went away, and then 6 years later, I became, for a casualty, I became a hazard of life, I became a film programmer. And then I in Lisbon, and so the next year I started co-directing a festival in Portugal called Doc Lisboa. And for me, I was coming completely out of this environment. And for me, one of the most important things was to address the fact that I felt that programmers were treated as exterior members of the festivals, as it was a very extractivist relationship. I had been staying in my house for 6 months, watching I don't know how many hundreds of films, and being paid by film, as if it could be, quantified like that. And so for me, immediately the big question, and one of the reasons why I wanted to be in a festival direction, was to address the way artistic labor was approached and its relation to production and managerial labor, and how these two questions should somehow be managed under the same values and the same risks. And so I was in that direction of Doc Lisboa for 8 years, and then I went to the UK, and I directed Sheffield Doc Fest in 2020, 2021. And then I left for artistic reasons with an MBA. And regardless of all the experiences I may have had, right now I'm in a moment in my life where I don't think I will direct a festival anymore. And because I realized that many of the things that I wanted to change are not changeable in institutions, non-profit also, and this neoliberal co-opting of interest, value, mission, etc. is quite true. But that it's not really going to happen in the traditional institutions. And so I'm extremely happy being an individual, standing for my own name as a freelancer. And so, I created a project with 2 other people at Union Docs called Artistic Differences. And it was partially inspired by that experience that I had before. And I work for other places, and that's how I'm happy now.
Thank you, Cintia.
Thank you.
Sorry to start the conversation. I would like to just kind of talk about where the ideologies of nonprofit support sort of come from, like get their roots. You know, we should recognize that in the history of nonprofit and institutional work has a lot of its roots in charity, paternalism, and othering. You know, charity kind of has this colonial, patronizing way of viewing people who are less fortunate as if they are another kind of human, somehow lesser than others. I definitely see this a lot in disability justice work, especially coming from folks who are not disabled. There are many ways that language is used to label, infantilize, and suppress people with disabilities. Terms like special needs, phrases like for a disabled person, which really reiterate difference, and as if there is some right way to be in the world. I also want us to think about that, you know, charity comes from this idea that you have to give to the less fortunate or else they'll revolt against you. So this is sort of a way in which you're both controlling people and helping people while also framing them as less fortunate. Sarah-Tai, I know you have a little bit of some things to say about this as well.
Yeah, I think that especially after my experience, especially after the uprisings, which were, never mind like the urgent reality of them, the way that that affected these paradigms that are already present in the industry for Black folks in them is, I don't know a word for the level of tired that we were during that summer. It was beyond. And I think the way that that has spurred more interest in at least the optics of institutions is irrevocably tied to those, to the ways that nonprofits were historically made to be. And for me, as someone who doesn't have any institutional affiliation, quite intentionally, like that is a movement towards a sort of harm reduction, which I don't mean to like use that glibly, obviously, but I just haven't found a better word for it. Where it's like, how can I make myself safe? How can I make a space that invites others in, especially as a curator, where I'm literally bringing in Black folks into these spaces. Yeah. And for me, part of that role has been to, you know, as someone who is working class myself, living in precarity, and is interested in artists who are also working in that area, just as a natural extension of my experience. It's always been really important for me to advocate for artists and say, just remember that they need you more than we ever need them. Yeah. The fact that they have these resources is not inherent to any good that they are doing at the end of the day. It's resource hoarding. And the fact that they want us now is only indicative of the fact that they are aware that people are looking at them in a certain way. And it is, as I said earlier, defensive capital. So, you know, if you're Black and you work with me, you're gonna get me going, no, let's go higher for the number. No, let's fuck with the timeline, because just playing along with this kind of charade of white supremacy culture within that context feels even more dissociative than it did before. And I think that, you know, there's just so many issues with approaching, speaking of my context specifically, which is so-called Canada, this, what's the word? Scramble for Black and Indigenous artists in particular is so transparent. So, you know, at the very least, what you can do is make enough space in that to make it feel at least less exploitative, less extractive. Not that that is changing the nature of that relationship, but we're all out here trying to survive mostly, you know. So.
Thank you.
If I can just jump in just to talk about the structure that you talked about, you know, just in terms of, even though a nonprofit is set up as a nonprofit, the way they operate is very much like a for-profit, just in terms of the structure, in terms of still watching the bottom line regardless, right? Because you are, and that's why I said that even though people may come together with some kind of goals in terms of what they want to achieve, they're very soon struck with having to create a board or who will then bring in money. And then that becomes the all-consuming activity and takes over in terms of priorities. It's very much like an NGO, who want to do work overseas and do this charity, but all the time, all they're doing is raising money. We very rarely hear about, and the charity, of course, that whole notion, that paternalistic attitude of giving. So all the people are lesser beings. And I think we bring that attitude into the institutions that we talk about, and just in that sense. And we also don't value the actual artists and the people whom we are serving. I mean, we are only where when I'm saying we, I'm talking of myself as kind of complicit because I'm on these boards. And what I have faced on the boards is often as a minority, the only racialized person on these boards. I'm often the only voice. And that's my own personal, I guess, challenge constantly, having to question and challenge. But now I've been able to work internally and able to sort of bring on more people so that we can collectively bring about changes. But I think it all goes back to the structure. And in terms of, I think people are trying to form co-ops, but I don't know yet if we have that kind of a model that can work effectively.
Cintia, as a former festival director, can you talk about financial structures and why you see having separation between artistic management and operational management is not healthy? Also, how did this lack of transparency on how investments spent out inside and outside the organization sort of exacerbate this situation?
Yeah, first, before that, sorry, just very quickly to address what was being said now. I forgot to say that I'm on the board of the Portuguese Documentary Association, which is in Portugal, we don't have charities. It works in a very different way. And actually, the word charity is quite awkward for the kind of organization. We call them civic associations. So they have associates, they vote, and anyway, but yeah, I sit on the board and it's also non-profit. And I just wanted to add to what was being said that I think it's not just the money issue, it's also the power and perception of power issue. And we cannot forget that in our industry, there is a flow of money, but there's also symbolic capital and and power is a lot related to that. And many times, very often, people who sit on the boards have vested interest. They get it brings legitimation, it brings network, it brings visibility, it brings a voice and a public voice. And that's something important. So I think that it's both things. It's money, but it's also management of power, actually, and the way the boards relate to the projects themselves, be it festivals, any organization. In terms of money, and I've always fought during my times as a festival director. I've always refused to be an artistic director or to be called an artistic director, because I'm completely against that model. And the reason why I'm against that model, well, it's vast, but the main reasons have to do with organization of power and the way. So first, I believe that, wherever money comes to an organization, of course, I'm not talking about purity. I'm not a Puritan in this sense, but the relation between money and values, the values that are defended by the organization needs to be somehow discussed, somehow clear. It doesn't have to be absolutely coherent. I mean, I completely understands that sometimes the world is incoherent, but it needs somehow to be open enough for discussion and for public discussion. And so when you separate artistic and managerial and the funding and the financial, the contracts, you separate labor relationships, you separate accountability, you create a sort of gray zone where the artistic on the one hand is reduced to some sort of optical side of the organization, some sort of public side of the organization that will kind of whitewash the organization if necessary, but also you reduce the accountability of the artistic too. So who gives money, how the money is given, and how it's distributed is deeply important, and it cannot be in any way separated. Also, because it's as important as who holds a microphone, how do you organize a roundtable, who gets invited to part. Everything for me is equally important, and so because it has to do with power, and we cannot forget that. And I mean, I can only speak for film festivals, which is my experience. It's a gatekeeping organization. Anyone who is there, working there, is working for a system of gatekeeping. And so it needs to be open to discuss power and to discuss its own power. And so the separation between artistic and managerial is a way of blocking that discussion and blocking the possibility of actually addressing those questions, which are deeply fundamental to the artists themselves. Because if you don't address how power is organized, how money is distributed, you don't address how forms are organized either, right? How can you take risk if you don't have any words about the contracts that are done, about the commitments that the organization has, about the interests that come into the organization? How can you manage risk? How can you bring challenge, artistic challenge, for example, or political challenge? And so I see too often festivals that kind of create this sort of, clean zone around the artistic, as if it was an advantage, right? Some sort of guarantee of purity. And what it makes is actually creates an illusion. When I see so often festivals showing political films, right, or having a political program but acting in a deeply different manner inside, that means that the artistic director, and the managerial director should be one person, because those people need to be accountable. Any director needs to be accountable for the films they show and for the way they treat their team. So for me, it's a very worrying sign, this fashion of separating and having this idea of the artistic director and the artistic value as something totally clean and pure and away from the capital and the financial and the power relations.
Thanks, Cintia. Just for a minute, I want to speak with Jemma. And this work isn't for us, really has given many of us the language to understand our experiences in predominantly white institutions. And can you talk a little bit more about the methodology of the study itself and why you didn't go with a traditional data-driven study?
I just wanted to also say that so much of what Cynthia just said, like I was thinking about, I guess I didn't have like the language to articulate it in that way, but I think what Cynthia has just described with what I was experiencing was just like this dissonance and this disconnect. And really feeling like, as like one of the only people of color, one of the only, actually the only working class person, really feeling like any activity that I did was covering like these things up, and that was an act of self-harm as well. And so it was just like this really, I don't know, it was a very self-reflexive piece, right? And data was what I was always like fed, like in these organizations, it was always about numbers. The numbers of our presence were low. And we need to change that by adding more numbers of people, right? But no one ever really talked about what it was like when you got there. And it was interesting you talking about methodology, because I've been thinking a little bit about this. I think my methodology was like yearning, like it was like political desire. It was just really thinking about like, I really want this to be different. Yeah. And how do I do that? And I think the numbers were like this. I'm not saying that numbers aren't necessary, because I think when you were talking longitudinally, Lalita, like there was a point when actually no one even knew how bad it was, right? And so the numbers have served their purpose. But what I found really interesting was like, as I was at the BFI for longer and longer, like these studies would be undertaken like periodically, And they would just tell you, like, actually a much better picture than the one that you experienced within an office, right? And it's like, I knew that I was the only person of color in my office, and I was like really shocked that everyone seemed surprised that there were numbers that overestimate that, right? And there would be this real performance of shock and sadness, and I think that numbers allow us to do the separation that Cynthia is describing. It allows you to perform shock because you've been immersed in all of this difference when you've been programming, or whatever you've been reading or engaging with, and actually then you can perform the shock of that. Oh, I didn't realize it was so bad because my intention was so good.
Yeah.
And I think I think a lot of it was about me wanting to reinsert my body into this discussion, and numbers didn't allow me to do that.
Yes.
I knew all of that. It meant nothing to me. It didn't help me to understand why I was experiencing things in the way that I was. So then it had to be that I had to examine. I think I had to examine why I had ended up in this situation that was actually so unsatisfying to me, and how much of it was like an actual decision that I had made, or if it was a decision that I'd been led into, which is why it's a really personal study, and it like goes right back to like, how my dad got his British passport, which went back to the East India Company and like this kind of sort of colonial like history, right? And that is the underpinnings of our charity structure as well in the UK, right? So our board structure was conceptualized by the East India Company, and just learning things like that felt way more useful than understanding the demographics of our industry, actually. And it asks you to act in a completely different way. And I think I wanted to sort of say that, like, also that data is deeply reformist, right? It's that kind of it's thinking about accountability in this coercive and punitive way, and not in a sort of transformative way, right? Like, it's just always like, let's just add more people in, but let's not think about what that means.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Rachel, in our prep conversations, you and I talked a lot about untangling webs of in which we've contributed to white supremacy culture, and maybe you can talk a little bit about the traps that folks get into that keep them in institutions, as well as the struggle of serving a mission that is still continuing harm.
Sure. I mean, I would again echo everything that Cynthia said about the separation of artistic and operational work being part of the problem. And also I read The Work Is Not For Us in the aftermath of the Tyneside stuff, Jemma. And again, I was like, wow, this is language that I had not even considered as part of this. When I was working as a full-time programmer at an independent cinema, it was my dream job. It's something that I had worked towards for years and made a lot of sacrifices to get to. I'd moved house at one point like 5 times in 2 years and moved cities a lot, and in order to pursue work. So I was like, I've arrived, when I got this job. And for a while it was really amazing, because as a programmer you feel like you have a degree of power, and you do. And I had 5 screens to play with, in a way I did, but I also didn't, because of the commercial requirements of cinema. But it was very exciting to be given access to this space. But I also had this very naive neoliberal idea that I could just kind of work away really, really hard in my little corner of the office. And because I felt that my intentions were good, that ultimately the outcome would be good and positive, right? So and a lot of the more progressive programming initiatives that I worked on were done in overtime. They were done at weekends. They weren't actually being paid for by the institution. For me, what was exciting was, oh, but you do have access to this space. You can have 1 slot a month for your queer film club, like this kind of thing, which was exciting. But that's part of the trap, right? Is there's this disconnect between the institution as like a monolithic symbolic force and the individuals that work within the institution, who are often really passionate people who have who engage with these films and have these ideas and these idealistic ideas, and can't necessarily see the perspective that what they're doing becomes part of the voice of the monolithic institution, and contributes to that culture and to that image. And I'm trying to think what I wanted to say there. I think I thought that I could, as an individual, change the culture of the organization just through my little, my programming work. And what I came to realize during the pandemic, when we had time to pause and think for a while, was actually I had been not doing that. I had been allowing things to continue as they were, because when staff members would say, there was a racist incident or there was a sexual harassment incident, people would say, but we have a feminist film strand, and that would be used as evidence that this couldn't possibly be the case. Another trap, I would say, though, is this narrative of scarcity in the industry, of precarity. I mean, it's a reality, it's not just a narrative. But when you think that this is the only full-time job you're going to be able to get, and it's amazing that you have it, and you don't question so many things, you don't necessarily push back, because you are in a privileged position. But this is why the reform is not going to work, right? Because that's a trap. That's another trap. And I think it's not a coincidence at all that the kind of disruptive scandal that erupted at my cinema came during a time when the cinema was closed for an extended period. And for the first time, a lot of people were having the chance to have perspective and to go, hang on, that wasn't right. I was in this very privileged, protected position as a programmer, but my hair was falling out due to stress, and I was not seeing my friends, and I didn't have a work-life balance. And until the pandemic, I didn't have time to begin reflecting. And then the very brave members of staff that came forward first and spoke on social media started this chain reaction where a lot of us were able to go, hang on, what have we been part of? What are we doing? What is the point? Which was really important for us. But I mean, how can you do that when you're exhausted and overworked all the time, and when you're really also underpaid? So you don't have time to take your holidays, and you don't have time to look after yourself. So these, that capitalist hustle culture is all part of the mechanisms that keep us trapped in these organizations and in these ways of thinking.
Thank you, Rachel. Let's take a minute and just sort of talk about NDAs and how they operate in protecting orgs from accountability.
Sorry, Ranell, can I just add one?
Yeah,
very
please.
quickly?
Sorry.
Sorry. I just wanted to bring up very quickly the issue, just thinking about, again, accountability and money, etc. Just wanted to add something I forgot, which is the question of public money. I see it very often, institutions that are mainly funded by public money, but not really following a public idea of mission. I mean, not in reality. I'm not talking about the discourse of self-representation. And it's very interesting because, for example, what Jemma was telling about, the numbers and the pressure of the numbers, if you are an institution funded mainly by public money, you're supposed to be contributing for many other things than just the idea of putting people on seats, right? You're supposed to have something more, and you're supposed to be talking about future, about building generations, about, education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's much wider and much more complex than just, the crashing things on numbers. And it's very often that, these institutions, they are mainly funded by the people's money, because public money is the people's money, right? And it needs to be said clearly. The money is treated as if it was private. It's co-opted by trustees, by directors, by, the way. So I think it's really important. And even for filmmakers, it's really important to go and look at to go and look at the reports, the financial report of the charities and associations, and see where the money comes from, and ask those institutions who are giving the money why they are giving the money. Because the first ones that are interested is the public and the filmmakers. Those are the ones that have all the right to ask questions.
Thank you, Cintia. Just to go back, Sarah-Tai, maybe you can talk about how does secrecy and isolation function in suppressing folks' experiences?
Yeah, sort of, how I mentioned earlier, is similar to Jemma. The process of speaking out was also like an experiential process of coming to a more expanded politics, coming to a more expanded understanding. You know, and I will never discount the active testimony, especially for Black folks. We have hundreds of years of experience of testimony on this land for good reason. But there was a point at which it actually became beneficial for the institution for them to continue to move in silence, so to speak, and to have the crazy Black femme yelling on the internet about things. And more than that, not having the social capital, not being located at a strong enough position of desirability to be supported publicly. I think as someone who called out the institution I worked for ahead of the so-called reckoning that happened,
Yeah.
it was a really fucking lonely time. No one
Yes.
cared.
Yes.
It actually only gained traction as a kind of issue in the Toronto art scene after the uprisings that happened, after white people had collected their Robin DiAngelo books. Side note, there are better books. I don't know what. Robin has a hold on you guys, hey? And it's really that embodied way of coming to know what you already feel and being able to express it through language, which is the function of that silence, the function of these NDAs, the function of statements rather than actual action, yes, but also a way of communicating that centers the personal, the embodied, and is not just an institutional form of communication. That function is to isolate you, it's to dehumanize you, it's to depersonalize you from yourself. It is, you know, that is the function of white supremacy, to make you feel alone so you can't collectively organize with your community. You know, even now I see Black folks who I consider friends working with images, and I'm just like, if not for me, why not for yourself? Why is it so? And I know they aren't paying shit, like, you know what I mean? Like, what this interest in capital and platform is so worth it to you that you would put yourself in a space so harmful that, like, my memory is gone. Cognitively, I am an entirely different person than I was 4 or 5 years ago.
Yes.
And yes, I did receive that so-called reparations, which I will refer to as a settlement because that's what it was. No amount of money could bring back that cognitive functioning for me. And yeah, I think, you know, I was listening to you, Rachel, answer the question. I think it's really interesting that the way that you were talking about wanting to transform the institution, that is like we all have like our beginning points in terms of like our institutional politics, but that is very much a beginning point for white people. Like for me, I knew it was already beyond potential for transformation. It was an act of trying to carve out a space, and in a way that was extremely harmful for me. And there's not a lot of Black people in the audience, so I won't go deep into like how light skin martyrdom manifests, but for me, it manifested as, I have to do this for my community. I'm here to not speak for, but make space for in a history that has been otherwise to that. So yeah, and I think with the things that have happened since that experience for me, like Trump and the rise of fascism globally, COVID, a lot of people are experiencing that cognitive dissonance of realizing the people that you thought were a certain way, thinking a certain way, are not that. And who's standing with you at the so-called end of the world, you know? So I think that on the institutional side, it is, I go back again to this defensive capital, because the way that accountability has been communicated by images and by other institutions, they don't care about me. We had a reparations agreement. They have not met a single requirement for that, but they toss it out as if that is part of their active process. They're defending their grants, their funding bodies, their audiences. It's the fact that people reached out and to stop being partners with them. You know, it's not me. It's not something that comes out of care or collective or actual community. And yeah, just going back again to that idea of who's not here. And I think I'm taking up a lot of time, I'm sorry, but we were talking kind of vaguely about, you know, in speaking of the methodologies of this work isn't for us. I think the reason, outside of like its own inherent value and your inherent capacity for care and the politics that you have, is that methodology is within and also with outside of like the kind of forms needed for it to succeed. You know, if there's a study, if there's a paper, if there's an article, that's always going to mean more than, you know, I think of J.G. LaBouvier and the things that happened to her at the Guggenheim. That's always going to mean more than a cell phone video recorded of her speaking back, yelling to them about their white supremacy. There's just so much to do with respectability, so much to do with class or even aspirational class positioning, where it's you have to be a certain type of person, not only to be heard, but to be supported.
Yeah.
So
I do want to open up to questions from the audience, but so maybe we can pass the mic while we discuss this question. I also actually want to share a couple of things that have kind of altered my ways of thinking very dramatically. One of them comes from one of my colleagues at 1 and 4, Jim Lebrecht, is that we need to stop rewarding people's ability to endure. It sets the wrong precedents for what makes people valuable. Another really great thing that Jennifer Crystal Chen shared with us in one of the recordings of What's Up with Docs, but surround yourself with people who want to do the work and stop caring for people who don't. It's not our job to convince them the change will still happen. Maybe they will one day realize they are the ones harmed by not changing, but we don't need to change them for that change to happen. White supremacy culture tells us we need them, but we don't. So I was
specifically about those two things that you've just shared, and also what Sarah-Tai was saying. I think the silencing is really fascinating to me because it's such. I come from the UK and we have a really strong class system, and I think there is a sense of discretion and respectability. Like if you can be discreet, that's like seen as professional. Yeah, and so you're given this thing like to shut you up, but actually you're presented it as something that's good for you, right? And actually the only thing that you have is your voice. And I think that what was really interesting recently, what happened in the UK was when the Queen died, and at the same time there was a murder of an unarmed Black man, and there was all of this deference to this royal family's grief. A loss of a person that had had a really privileged, long life, that they needed to grieve in private. But this mother and father had to grieve really publicly because that was the only way that they could get accountability. And I think about that a lot is like, yeah, what do you have to perform? What form in which do you have to speak? But also how much power there is in not listening and telling you to stop talking now, right? And then I guess the other thing that I wanted to say is that I have also come to see the privilege of silence as well after this experience.
Yeah.
That now that I have, because of this work and because of whatever reason, am someone that is sometimes listened to now, I can choose not to speak, but that is a choice. And before it wasn't a choice. And I think that is something that I would like us to think about how do we increase choices for people rather than decrease them. And then something that you were touching on, that everyone's been touching on, is actually I've been thinking about like white feminism and the role of that, like because all of these people that I've worked with have been white women who say they're feminists.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
And that's that's it basically.
It looks like Bridget had
Sorry.
wants to say something.
I'm super sorry. I can't help myself. I can't, because also, Jemma, your work really, now I want to like cry about it, like helped me so much in like the loneliest place. And it's so like the parallels between all of our stories are so like, it's all the same. And like the first thing is like, we've got to end the gender binary. And I'm like so unpopular for that opinion, and like also shot down by white feminists in public and really established members of our community who say that, like, you know, oh, we have more women in power, things will get better. But it's like such a fake, like it's so fake. It's another one of these traps. Whereas like misogyny is in everybody and racism is in lots of bodies on this planet. And it's an active choice to like not be racist and not be a misogynist and also treat yourself well. And for me, like your work was so important because it brought me back to like Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks. And then you approach things from love. And so you don't become like a bitter person, because my institutional discrimination led me to believe that like I had no worth and I wasn't like a beautiful person. And it took me like a full year to be like, oh, wait, I am a beautiful person. And also it's really interesting because I'm learning so much every day, which is like the best part about being freed from like institutional responsibilities, and also the care of people who are under your care, as like when you're in a powerful position and you have staff who work for you, which was also part of like my deep burnout at the end. But like now I see also that my freelance life, which is going so well, like I'm so shocked that people like hire me all the time. And I'm so shocked that I'm doing like all of these joyful things and like working with wonderful people, because I was really under the impression that I was like unhireable. And like my work means so much to me. And so like it's such a like important and lived embodied part of who I am. And when you face like this awful rejection and then awful sexism and awful homophobia and awful like class warfare, essentially, I see it as like a war. Like it's so nice to know that like we're in this room filled with people who like are going through the same shit, but at least we can talk about it. And the best part is my institution didn't ask me to sign an NDA, so I'm very happy to discuss over cocktails. But my experience was because they didn't even see it as shameful. They weren't even ashamed, like, which is also super weird. So I'm so glad that I know Tony, and I'm so glad that I know you, and I'm so glad that I read This Work Isn't For Us. And I'm also so glad that I watched the thing that you did during Cannes, because like, and I was also thinking like, man, this pandemic really sucks, but it's great for some movements because we aren't interrupted by misogynists or racists. And so we can actually express our truth. Yeah, sorry for that.
Do you want to speak back to that a little?
Just,
And like, kind of complicate this notion that I see.
Yeah, I also want to share something really
I'm
quickly.
actually speaking still.
Hold on just 1 second.
I do want to complicate this notion that you either are or you are not racist, you either are or you are not misogynist, because it does speak directly to my experience. For those who don't know, the person who directly harmed me was a non-Black person of color who identified as a communist. Loudly, I'm a communist as well, but it doesn't matter because I'm Black, and I'm too loud and I'm all the bad things. But it was this idea that being racist, being misogynist, being ableist is a question of morals and intent rather than something that is ingrained within us and involves active critique and active action to work not beyond, but alongside. You know, it also positions non-white people in this position of, and we see this a lot, especially in America, the narrative surrounding Black women saving us. Not only is that like a horrible, exhaustive pressure to put on the shoulders of Black women, but it flattens us into, I say us, but I'm trans, but I have affinity for y'all, you know, but it flattens us into this assumed same politics, which is truly not the case. And it is this kind of assumption that I could never be that, which was particularly the context of the person who harmed me directly the most. It was the context of this institution that was not, you know, it wasn't a TIFF, it wasn't an IDA, it was an experimental moving image arts festival that foregrounded so-called radical work.
Yep.
You know, it's this idea that I could never be that, and therefore I won't take your experience with any sort of validity, because I could never. So I just wanted to speak back to that.
Before we move to this next question, I know Lalita, you
No,
had something.
no, I just wanted to just address this point about, being able to speak in a safe space and speak among our peers and speak a certain language, which I think you get to that point where you feel comfortable. But there is a parallel conversation going on in some other place with, and I just find it's very hard to get people to understand. I mean, I sometimes feel there is always going to be this parallel conversation. I don't know about change. I don't know if people really change. I've just become very disillusioned about that because you've just been through this so frequently, so many training programs, so many institutions try to put all these plans in place, and then they go and hire someone, and then it's usually someone who's co-opted or someone who speaks and talks like them, just maybe a person of color who's then co-opted completely into doing whatever they want. Yeah. So it's this issue of about safe spaces. I feel that we need to go out there and be speaking out, not in safe places anymore. But find a way to speak out.
But also it's what you were saying, Sarah-Tai, that it's a practice, right? And we're just so practiced with a way of relating to one another, right? That is framed by the white supremacy culture, whatever you want to call it. And I think what we're all talking about, and the reason why I talked about feminism is that I think that like the feminists who I listen to and I learn from, largely Black feminists, like they would talk about feminism as this practice of ethical relations, right? That it's about transforming our relationships with each other so that they're better. And I don't think that's what sometimes our conversations about change, I don't think they're about that. They're about changing something else, something less interrelated, less about our responsibilities towards each other. I just wanted to add that because I think that was really came across in the panel this morning about the subjects as well. That is something that documentary filmmakers are trying to practice differently, and that's difficult because we're just not used to it. That's not how we relate to one another. We relate to each other, as Cintia said, through modes of really power dynamics that we didn't choose, right? That we inherit. And I think it's really clear to me, especially like growing up in the UK, like who that serves.
Well, I've actually been told that we're out of time. I know I'd love to engage with people a lot more, but I guess I want to leave folks at least with a final thought of the people in power have a responsibility to listen more and stop centering what they have to say and think. While people with less power have the responsibility to tell the truth and stop protecting those with power. Thanks, everyone. Hope to get to speak to a lot of you. So thank you.